Well, I said I would open because I have an apologia to offer. The women in the audience, this will mean nothing to you, but the men will all understand. I went to bed 2 nights ago with a scratchy throat as Kent Nerburn. I woke up as Barry White. About halfway through the morning, I had a blessed moment passing where I was Leonard Cohen. By noon, I was Bernie Sanders. And by evening, I was Kermit the Frog. Now, today, I've awakened again, and it sounds okay so far. I'd like to hit the Leonard Cohen mark, but if I don't, if I start hacking and coughing, that gives David more time. But so, my apologies to you for the throat over which I have so little control. But what I wanted to do as a starting point is to say, this is an arranged marriage. You know, we had the names dropped on each other. You know, we're going to be on the stage together. And David knew something of me. I knew nothing of David. And I picked up his work and started listening to him and reading his work. And I said, my God, this guy's good. He understands how to weave the personal and the historical in a way that's engaging. And that's a hard thing to do. And I came away with several thoughts. And the one that stuck out about what I think makes this arranged marriage such a good one is what an elder once told me when I was doing an oral history project on the Red Lake Reservation. He said, always teach by stories, because stories lodge deep in the heart. And David and I both believe very strongly in the power of story. And what I'd like to say, just as an introduction to David's work, is his willingness to stand truthfully against some of the stereotypes, and not only some of the stereotypes, but some of the realities, finding the exceptions that prove the rule of native life, made me aware of what a courageous writer he is. And that was the takeaway I ultimately had. This is a man of immense courage and compassion. And we decided, since all of you know, some of you may know one of us, few of you may know both of us, and many of you may know neither of us. So in that case, what we thought we would do is we would start by reading. So David is going to read first, and away we go.
Well, hello everyone. I'm Petu Washte. Machiapi David Heska, Wanbli, Weiden. Good day, my name is Dave. And I want to say how honored I am, and I want to thank Kent for those very, very generous words. And I also want to provide an acknowledgement to the Cheyenne and Arapaho upon whose land we stand. But a land acknowledgement is an empty gesture unless it comes with a call to action. And so I always accompany my land acknowledgements with some sort of call. And the issue upon which I'm currently researching and writing upon is the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so I urge you, if you can, there are many organizations out there that support this cause. And so my call to action today is to support the cause of trying to find a remedy for missing and murdered Indigenous women. So, thank you. And, you know, let me now talk about this man because I have been a fan for a long time. Folks, if you don't know Neither Wolf Nor Dog, I am urging you to go out and get it. I read this book years ago, and it touched me. If you heard my interview on Colorado Public Radio yesterday, I said that Kent Nerburn is one of the most wonderfully sensitive and wonderfully empathic and empathetic writers out there writing about Native issues, and I mean that. I have read all of these. I have 3 or 4 more of his books at home, and we're going to get a chance to talk about those today. But this is a tremendous writer. But more than that, I'm going to embarrass him now, and I'm going to read a little statement from his bio that I think really sums up the genius of this gentleman right here. So these are his words here. My work has been a constant search from various perspectives for an authentic American spirituality, integrating our Western Judeo-Christian tradition with the other traditions of the world, and especially the indigenous spirituality of the people who first inhabited this continent. Someone once called me a guerrilla theologian, and I think that is fairly accurate. So really, very nice. So we're going to have a chance, I think, to talk about Mr. Kent's work and some of the things here, and we appreciate him speaking with us with a scratchy voice and all that. We did agree that, just to give him a little break on the voice, I'd read a little bit first. So I have a couple of things that I'll talk about here. So this is the galleys for my children's book, Spotted Tail. So Spotted Tail, I'm not really a children's book writer, but nobody had written about the great Sichangu Lakota leader of my people. So I wrote this children's book, and it was illustrated by a native artist. I received no royalties from the sale of this book. I have instead taken the amount of money that they paid me, and I will be purchasing, when it's published November 1st, about 500 copies at my own expense that I will be donating to every school, library, on the 4 Lakota reservations, and any family that cannot afford one on my reservation, I will get this to them. So Spotted Tail is coming out from Raycraft Books. They're a wonderful new publisher for marginalized voices for children, because we often don't see enough books out there for kids, from diverse backgrounds. And so I'm very proud to be associated with them. And again, I make no money from this, so I just want to, again, thank you. Now, what I'm going to read here, I'm scanning the audience and making sure there are no kids in the room, and I don't see any, because I also do have a novel coming out from Echo HarperCollins, and it's a little bit rough, so I'm going to give a trigger warning right now. So if you're opposed to violence or some bad words, I'm just going to let you know right now. So this book is called Winter Counts, and it's due August 2020 from HarperCollins. And it deals with the greater theme of criminal justice on the reservations. So again, I spoke about this on NPR yesterday, but the problem is that on reservations, you have 3 different levels of jurisdiction. You have national governments, state governments, and tribal governments, all of which overlap, and it makes it very difficult to punish crimes that occur on the reservation. And there's a law called the Major Crimes Act, which takes away the ability of Native peoples to punish felony crimes on our own reservations. Instead, if someone rapes a woman or harms a child, Native authorities must contact federal prosecutors and turn it over to them. But here's the problem. Federal prosecutors are declining to prosecute these crimes about 30 to 50% of the time. We're talking rapes, we're talking murders, we're talking children being harmed. And so what has happened is there is a class now of private enforcers, vigilantes, that if you can't get justice from the authorities, you hire a private enforcer. So this is the first 4 pages from Winter Counts. I leaned back in the seat of my old Ford Pinto, listening to the sounds coming from the depot, the reservation's only tavern. There was a stream of Indians and white ranchers going inside. I knew Gov Yellowhawk was there with his buddies, pounding beers and drinking shots. Gov taught gym at the local school, football, basketball, soccer. But word was that he sometimes got a little too involved with the students, both boys and girls. I was going to let him get good and drunk, then the real party would start. I had brass knuckles and a baseball bat stowed in my trunk, but those wouldn't be necessary. Gov was a fat-ass piece of shit with a fry-bread gut as big as a buffalo's ass. I'd been hired to beat the hell out of Gov by the father of a little girl at the school. Gov had sneaked up on the little girl in the bathroom, held her down, and raped her. The girl's parents had confronted the school's principal, but Gov came from one of the most powerful families on the res, and the school refused to take any action. The principal had even threatened a lawsuit against the parents for making a false accusation. Tribal police couldn't do anything. The feds prosecuted all felony crimes on the res, and they didn't mess with any crime short of murder. Now, the little girl was too scared to go back to her class, and he was free to molest other kids. I'd waived my fee for this job. Usually, I charged $100 for each tooth I knocked out and each bone I broke. But I decided to kick Gov's ass for free. I'd hated him for years. Even as a teenager, he was a mean asshole who terrorized other kids, especially Ieskas like me. Of course, Gov had always been accompanied by his gang. I couldn't remember him ever fighting solo, but tonight was his time. The stones, gimme shelter, drifted through the door of the bar to the parking lot, leaving little melodic ripples like ghosts in my head. I lit a cigarette and waited for Gov. He'd come out sooner or later. An hour later, I spotted him walking out of the bar. He was singing an off-key tune and stumbling. I slipped out of the Pinto and crouched behind his shiny new pickup. He'd parked at the far end of the lot so that no one would ding his expensive ride. That suited me just fine. I could enact some Indian justice away from any of Gov's drinking buddies. I moved out from the shadows. He wore faded jeans and a t-shirt with a Fighting Sioux mascot. His eyes were foggy and he stank of beer. I could see the birthmark on his forehead that looked like a little tomahawk. "Hey, Gov." "The fuck?" He squinted into the darkness, unable to pinpoint who was speaking to him. "It's Virgil." "Who?" "Virgil Wounded Horse." "Oh, are you drinking or what? The bar just closed." "Yeah, I know it closed. I was waiting for you." "What for?" "Grace Little Thunder." Gov's face darkened. "Ain't seen her. That's not what I hear." "I take care of the Wakaneja, show them how to be Lakota. Sometimes the parents don't appreciate it." "The way of the world, huh?" I moved between Gov and the truck. "I teach the kids, help their families. Sometimes they want more than I can give." "Saint Gov, just a guy who likes to cornhole the boys and finger the girls. You know how kids are. They want attention. They make shit up. People make a fuss over them." "The other kids making shit up too? I heard about you and little Mikey Dupree." Gov tried to move past me. "I don't need this bullshit. I ain't seen you out there helping the Ayate. From what I hear, you don't do nothing. You got shit to say, take it up with Principal Smith. I'm getting out of here." "Don't think so." "Look, asshole, Grace Little Thunder's family is nothing but trash. Her mom's a drunk, and her dad ain't worked in 10 years. That girl is only 9 years old. Eat shit. What business is it of yours?" I landed a hard body shot to Gov's midsection. The punch would have knocked most men out, but his massive stomach absorbed most of the blow. "Heska, motherfucker," Gov snarled, and he lunged at me. I saw the move coming, sidestepped it, and smashed him in the jaw. Gov shook his head like a wet dog. How the fuck was he still standing up? I thought about grabbing the baseball bat. Then I felt a blinding pain in my side. A blow to the kidney, then another, this one worse than the first. Waves of electricity, neural impulses. Gotta stay up. Don't go down or it's finished. Reeling, dizzy, I tried to puzzle out a strategy, but my mind was like an iceberg, slowly bobbing in the waters. "You half-breed bastard," he roared. I felt his spittle on my face, and then I was on the ground. Shit, he kicked me on the back, over and over, each blow a jackhammer. I tried to maneuver through the cloud in my brain. Gov panted, out of breath, running out of gas. Grab his feet, I thought. I snaked down my arm and yanked his legs. He went down with a thud, and I saw my opening. I stood up, grabbed his right arm, and twisted it behind his back until I felt some resistance. Then I twisted some more. "How you like that, you son of a bitch?" Gov looked up at me and hissed, "Fuck you, Haffy." I had to hand it to him. Gov had some balls. I flashed back to high school when I'd been much smaller, not the big guy I was now. I remembered all the times that I'd been held down and beaten by Gov and the other full-bloods. My angry tears, the humiliation still with me. I wondered if I should let Gov go, show him the mercy that I'd never been given. That was the Lakota way, wasn't it? Wakantognaka, one of the 7 Lakota values. It meant compassion, generosity, kindness, forgiveness. I remember the lessons of my teachers back in school. They taught that the greatest honor, the greatest bravery came when a warrior chose to let his enemy go free and touched him with the coup stick. Legend was that even Crazy Horse had shown his courage by counting coup on a Pawnee warrior once, chasing him across the river, but deciding not to kill him, to honor his bravery and grant him his freedom. I knew the honorable thing to do, the Lakota way, was to set Gov free without any more punishment. Fuck that. I twisted his arm until it came loose from the socket with a sickening crunch. Then I stepped back and I kicked him in the cheek with all my force, snapping his head back violently. I took my boot heel and smashed it down on his face, teeth snapping like stale potato chips. I kneeled down and I grabbed his hair. "Listen to me, you wink-tay asshole. You ever touch another kid at that school, I'll cut your dick off and shove it down your throat. You hear me, skin?" He didn't say anything. His left eye was swollen and bloody, his nose seemingly gone, pounded back into his face. Blood streamed from the black hole of his former nose and mouth. How's that for counting coup, asshole? I leaned over to see if he was still breathing. A few faint breaths. I saw some teeth lying on the concrete. They looked like little yellow tombstones. I scooped them up and stuck them in my pocket. Thank you.
Oh, nice. Well, I've not heard that before, and you can see the capacity to embed knowledge in a story there, and also the power of the dialogue, dialogue ain't easy stuff, I'm telling you. It's real easy to make pronouncements rather than get inside the characters. But I have a question for you when I hear that. Many years ago, when I was working on Red Lake, the specifics are not important, but I got a little too close to a few things. And a guy came over, we lived way out in the woods, about 15 miles from the reservation and 15 miles from the nearest town. And had a young family, and it was certainly isolated and vulnerable. And a man came up to me one day on the reservation and said, you know, I just wanted to tell you about this friend of mine, my brother. You know, he started asking about stuff that he shouldn't have been asking about, and you know, he's not, he ain't around anymore. He's in the nursing home because a guy came up and shoved a broomstick down his throat, down to his belly, and I just thought you ought to know. I was locking doors after that, and my question is, are you a little worried about this? You don't live on the res, but you go back to the res. Have you gotten close to something that's maybe that you have to be a little nervous about?
I mean, are you saying am I worried about maybe talking too much about our traditions and all that?
I don't know.
No,
just
no.
Yeah, just whatever comes to mind, because you're revealing things that people don't always want to hear about or want told.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I do feel that the private enforcers on the res is not a secret at this point. If you're familiar with a friend of mine, Craig Johnson, who wrote the Longmire series, he has a character in there that's a private enforcer, Hector. I need to point out that I wrote about it first. I published a short story based on winter counts before Hector came out. I'm not worried about that, but what I am worried about is in my novel, I do talk about a sacred ceremony called a Yuwipi. Now, in the native world, it is very, very taboo to write too much about some of our sacred ceremonies, such as the sun dance and some other things. So in the Yuwipi ceremony, which comes in the climax of my book, what I do is I wrote as much as already been out in the public domain and no further. So there were some things that I chose not to reveal. So that's sort of the line that I drew for myself.
Mm-hmm. And it is, you know, it is a novel, but there's a lot of stuff embedded in there. And it's a fine line when you are trying to do storytelling to teach. And I think both of us share that belief that ultimately our job is as teachers. I mean, all of us out here, that's our job in life is to be teachers. And when you reach out with stories, you know, you're teaching, and you use whatever tools are at your command. And in the case of storytelling, you know, you blend fact, you blend fiction. Like when people ask me about Neither Wolf Nor Dog, they say, is it fact or is it fiction? I say, yes. And it's not a good answer, but it's the truth, because you need to make your stories come alive, because they need to, as the elder said to me, they need to lodge deep in the heart. You want people leaving the reading of your works thinking that they've been present to something that's real. And so this feels real. I'm looking forward to it. Oh. And I assume it's a little different than the child's book on Spotted Tail.
Book, yeah.
Right.
Well, let me jump in here because, Kent, I don't know if you want to read, but I do know, I want to let everybody know. So again, I've already told everyone how wonderful this book is, and I really mean that, okay? Neither Wolf Nor Dog is one of the great books in the native tradition and written by this wonderful writer over here. It is out in a 25th anniversary edition, with a foreword by none other than Robert Plant. Now, I do not have the new edition, but I would love to see it. And I'm wondering if you either want to read or if you want to tell us that story, because I am dying to hear it.
Well, I will both read and tell you the story. So those of you who don't know, well, I caught lightning in a bottle with this book. I didn't know what I had. It was written 25 years ago after I'd just completed working on the Red Lake Reservation. I'd been doing oral history there. And in the course of working on the reservation, I made two distinct discoveries. And one was that the truth of the Native experience had been effectively expunged from the American historical narrative. I mean, we're a people of optimism and progress, and everything can be fixed. Everything can be made better. Time will heal all wounds. We're not a people of tragedy. And what has happened to the Native peoples in this country is a tragedy, and we don't want to look at it. And so it's hidden from view. And I realized that the more I talked to people about things like the boarding schools, which I address in The Wolf at Twilight, about the beliefs, about their experiences, and I saw how wounded a people were, post-traumatic stress disorder of an entire culture. And I felt this deeply in my heart because I also knew these people as the most joyful and spiritually grounded people that I ever dealt with. The other thing that I learned was that there were values in the Native way of living that we needed to listen to. The belief that in the sort of the caricatured term that we are of the land. We are not apart from the land, we are of the land. A larger understanding of the sense of family. Feeling of that there's spirit inheres in everything, and that we're here to learn from the world rather than to dominate the world. And even though these things are very often sort of obfuscated and hidden under the detritus of what's left of the culture, the kind of things that you're writing about, they're still there. When you hear, just a simple example, when someone talks about someone who has recently died as having walked on rather than having passed away. This speaks to death as a continuous part of a path of life, not a separation and a disjunction. And these kind of terms are everywhere. They're embedded in the whole culture. You don't see them automatically. And I'd seen all this, and I said, I need to tell these stories. I got fired. I often say that if you work on the reservation, if you don't get fired, you haven't done a very good job. And I got fired because I got too close to things. And I cared so much about what I had learned and what I had seen that I said, I've got to write a book that tells the truth about that. Well, the book is neither wolf nor dog. I won't go into exactly what it was and how it was constructed, but we have here a story of my encounter with a man named Dan, a 78-year-old Lakota man. And he wants me to do something with his stories, his knowledge, and asks me to come to the reservation. He and his friend Grover essentially kidnapped me, pulled some tricks on me and kidnapped me, and we end up traveling, and Dan decides to teach me. And the passage I'm going to read, he slowly, he doesn't trust me right away. I'm a white guy. He's worried about my objectifying him, my not understanding, and so I'm constantly being tested. And at one point, we're traveling through the Badlands, and there's a great storm. And this storm, Dan, who saw a message, like many Native people, sees everything as having a message in it. And he heard a message in the storm, and he thought it was the voice of his son, who had died. It had been about my age. There's all sorts of twisted things about fathers and sons. I shouldn't even say twisted. Honest things about fathers and sons, about his dead son, about my responsibility to tell the story that his son was going to tell. And anyway, he and Grover and I, Dan has talked to me about the ghost dance and about the pain that he felt and saying, I wish I knew why it had to happen this way. I could have so much more peace if I just knew why it had to happen this way. So the passage I'm going to read is right after that particular instance. We're just leaving, driving out of the Badlands. It's called Pahasapa. We drove in heavy silence. I sat, pensive, chastened, saddened. Dan hunched in front of me within a hand's grasp but 1,000 miles away. The looming sandstone menhirs and dolmens became fewer, then smaller, then gave way completely to rolling grasslands. The Badlands had disappeared as abruptly as they came. Drover's Buick cut through the night. Here and there we would pass by some tiny shipwreck of a town devoid of lights, with a huddling cluster of abandoned wooden buildings standing sway-backed against the cold illumination of the moon. Under the empty lunar gaze, the whole world turned to silver. Everything was alive, yet there was no life anywhere. It was a land of phantoms. Our car seemed a tiny projectile coursing through a silent universe. It was as if we were the observed, not the observer. We had to pass through quickly, benignly, without intrusion or incident. To our left, the hills rose up to meet rocky outcroppings that had pushed through the earth like bone through skin to make high grassy ridges that ran for miles along the side of the road. Carcasses of abandoned cars rested silent on the hillsides. Where the ridges broke, long draws ran down between them, dry memories of forgotten creeks and streams. Scrub oak clustered against them, like animals gathered to slake their thirst. In the dark, they could have been huddled herds of buffalo or grizzlies come together under the full moon. In the distance, I could make out the ragged contours of the Black Hills. The outcroppings and draws we were passing were the first hint of their presence. I remembered the journeys as a child in a borrowed car through the seemingly endless spaces and unforgiving Dakota heat toward those same ragged outlines. But then it was to ride the narrow-gauge trains and visit the reptile gardens and pony rides that had sprung up everywhere to take advantage of the presence of those 4 gigantic stone faces carved in the side of the mountain called Rushmore. Now this tiny outcropping of mountains was something less seen than felt, a home, a presence, a gathering place of spiritual forces, the Pahasapa, the sacred center of the universe for the Lakota people. Their presence seemed active, more like a sentinel than a destination. For a moment, and dimly, I lost my own eyes and saw what the eyes Dan had given me, saw the huddled people in their blankets, desperately trying to outrun an army that had committed itself to killing every man and woman and child and infant that had dark skin or spoken a tongue born of this land. I heard the voices of mothers trying to keep track of each other in the swirling snow, slowing to help the old people who could neither walk nor understand why they had to flee, pulling their own clothes from their bodies to wrap their freezing children tighter against the winter night, saw them huddling together in the freezing darkness, afraid to build a fire against the ice and wind of December, because the men who were hunting them like animals would see it and come riding in and rip their children from their arms before pumping bullets into their hearts, their legs, their skulls, and then riding off. But most of all, I felt the pain of their confusion that their God had failed. In a land that as a child had filled me with dreams of pony rides and ice cream cones and 4 presidents' heads on a mountain, people who had sensed the power of God in every rock and bird and square inch of land had been reduced to dancing crazily in a circle in hopes that their desperate ecstasy would call forth a savior who would keep them from having to watch one more of their children die, hollow-eyed and uncomprehending, in their arms. The last afterglow of twilight had silhouetted the Black Hills against the night. It was easy to understand how they had become the sacred center. They stood mutely, majestically in the middle of this endless plain, like a cathedral of the gods. For these mountains, I thought, the Lakota had been willing to give away everything else, only to have them, too, taken away when white people who had trespassed illegally shouted the magic word gold, the metal that makes the Wasichu crazy, the Lakota had called it, an ore in the ground. For that, my ancestors had been willing to lie and steal and kill old people and children, and then spend the next century remaking the story so that all the dead and all the betrayals would effectively disappear from history. For that, and the hunger to own a piece of the earth, we had destroyed the dreams and families of an entire race, leaving them homeless, faithless, and with nothing but the ashes of a once graceful and balanced way of life. And now we had the arrogance to claim to rediscover them and to appropriate the very spiritual truths we had tried to destroy in order to fill the void of our own spiritual bankruptcy. I was filled with a helpless shame and contrition. My mind moved fitfully across this bleak inner terrain, seeking rest and finding none. Dan's motionless form was outlined against the night. I wondered how he could live with such rage, how anyone could live with such rage. His last words, "I just wish I knew why it happened this way," echoed in my mind. The Pahasapa rose ragged against the western sky as Grover's headlights strafed the silent land. And I, too, wondered why it had to happen that way, and if this earth, with the knowledge it had, would ever grant any of us peace. So, yeah, that's sort of, even when I read it, I was so far inside the experience when I was with these people. I cannot tell you the love that I have for the family, the Native family, and the way they've embraced me. And it's hard being a non-Native writer writing about Native things. You're accused of being trafficking in Indian themes for fun and profit, and anyone who's a writer knows that it's neither fun nor profitable, but you're taking chances. We're both taking chances when we do this. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. I'll tell you the Robert Plant story. Should I do it now, or should we?
Please.
All right, Robert Plant. We know who Robert Plant is, right? This all actually started not far from here in the Tattered Cover Bookstore in Denver. I'm sitting at home in northern Minnesota, and I get a call from my publisher, and they said, some woman just got in touch with us, and she said she represents some famous person who wants to talk to you. Well, you soon learn as a writer that one of the gifts and the perils of the craft is that people assume they know you because they read you and they're intimate with you, but you don't know who they are. So people ranging from the very good-hearted to the manifestly insane get in touch with you. And it's very often the insane who have no sense of proportion. I mean, I literally once had a man and his 2 kids arrive on my front doorstep from Scotland because he wanted to meet me, and they were going across the country. This sort of thing happens. So I get this call, and the woman says, and I say, sure, who is this guy? And he said, his name is Plant, Robert Plant. And I said, you mean like the Led Zeppelin guy? I was never a great Led Zeppelin fan when I was younger. I knew who he was. And I said, sure, I'll talk to him. So anyway, the woman connects me with Robert. Robert's on tour out on the East Coast. And he calls me, and we talk a bit, and I said, he said he'd been telling everyone on the tour about the book. He picked it up in tattered cover and was looking for something to read. And he was telling everyone about the book and bending their ear about it, and said he had spent years working in Texas, living in Texas, and as anyone who grows up in Europe, they learn all this about Native Americans, and he saw none of them. He saw none of this. He said, where are they? What's this about? So he'd gone into tattered cover and picked up neither wolf nor dog. So he said to me, well, will you be speaking anywhere in the near future? And I said, well, I'm going to be at the South Dakota Festival of the Book in Deadwood. He said, well, maybe I'll pop out. Okay. Well, sure enough, Robert pops out. He and his girlfriend at that particular time come out and all hidden away, get a little Airbnb, and I go up to the door and knock on it, and there's Robert. So I meet Robert. We start talking together. And he's a wonderful man. I mean, he's not at all what I would have expected. This is a man who's lost a son, who's lost his best friend when he started with Led Zeppelin. And like he said, how would you like to have had your identity determined or frozen in time between the ages of 18 and 24? And what would it be like to have all the money in the world and be able to do anything that came into your mind? And yet he was a gracious, kind man. And we got to be friends. I refused to talk to him about music. I wanted to talk to him about fatherhood, about the creation of art. And so anyway, when I got done with my talk, I said, you got any time? He said, sure. So let's go for a drive. I'll take you down to the reservation. We went down through Pine Ridge and out to Wounded Knee. And we got there on the night of the blood moon, and it was the full moon. It was the full moon in the autumn, and it was a blood moon, and it was a very powerful experience. And he was able to travel without being recognized, which is impossible for him. Anyway, long story short, he took the book back to England with him. We got to be good friends, and I've since visited him there. My wife and I have gone over and spent time with him. And he took it back and gave it to the publisher at Canongate. It's a very high-quality publisher in England, and they decided to publish an edition in England. And so they did. But the publisher, of course, one word from Robert Plant is worth 1,000 tomes from Kent Nerburn in terms of selling a book. So anyway, he asked Robert to write an introduction. And Robert said, I don't know, I can't do it. Have someone else do it. And he after months, the guy wanted Robert's introduction. So anyway, Robert at some point said, I can't do this, I got nothing. So I said, let me see what you got. So he sent it to me. And I said, I see what this is. This guy is a songwriter. It's epigrammatic, but it's brilliant and insightful. And so I took it and I started moved it all around and produced the foreword that he wrote, which we used in that book, and we have in this New American edition as well. And if you'll indulge me just a little bit more, I'll read it. It's very short, but I think it's just absolutely wonderful. It's called The Voice of the Native Heart by Robert Plant. And you can see, just from looking at this, the way it's lined out like a poem, more than written as a narrative. It's a dirty, familiar history, a story of broken treaties, giddy expansion, collision, and relocation, of abuse, denial, and unfair advantage, as far from the Lone Ranger as one can imagine. For almost 50 years on journeys through the extremes of the New World, I have wrestled with the questions and carried the weight of empire. For many years, Kent Nerburn, too, has been immersed in the inflamed frontier that separates and divides. Neither wolf nor dog takes us on a real-life journey, playing out the exhausted residue, the push and pull between our cultures, bringing into sharp focus the fallout from the European slog, the consuming lurch and stampede for more. Here is revealed with beauty and sensitivity a world of miracles and connections we can only marvel at, a world that reaches out, staggering but still alive, despite the havoc of the covered wagon and cultural abuse. His characters twist and turn the imagination as they reveal slowly the wonders of the natural world and our relationships within it. Kent's work has been my companion and will always remain so, otherworldly and ever more valuable to us in the confusion of these modern times, this voicing of the remarkable spirit of an amazing people. It's kind of it's a little, he'd kill me if I said it, but it kind of ascends like a stairway to heaven,
Well, I see that we want to leave some time for the audience. Is that right? Well, the only thing that I want to say here is Kent is too modest to point it out, but his new book is Dancing with the Gods, and I think this may be the only book of his that I haven't read yet. And maybe can you give us just a quickly tell us?
Sure.
Because I know this is a departure from what you typically have written on, and I think we'd all like to hear about this book.
One of the real lessons I've learned in working with Native people is that they don't see the world, our lives, as a straight line from birth to death, where the most important part of life is the time of productivity in the middle. Instead, it's a cycle through the seasons of life. And only those at the end of life have seen the previous seasons. And so once you achieve a status of the elder, you have a responsibility to turn and face those who are coming up behind you and speak about what it is that you've learned. Well, I thought, well, what is it I can do? I've reached that age where, I'm on the clock now and I don't know what I've got left, so I need to turn and face my audience. What can I write about? Well, I can write some about what I've learned from Native people, but that's somewhat disingenuous. Let someone else do that. I'll write about the arts, what it is to have a life in the arts, because I've known the Robert Plants of the world. I've been a sculptor for 20 years. I was a writer now for 30 years. And I wanted to write about what it was that people need to know, the young people. It was all based on a letter that I got from a girl, which was very much like a letter that I had written one time to Norman Mailer when I was young, asking if he would let me come and work with him. And of course he wouldn't, but I actually have the letter in here. He was very gracious. And I always swore I would always try to give back that graciousness because he saved a drowning man with that letter. So I decided I wanted to write about the issues, not just how, everyone knows that it's a horrible life economically, like we say, it's a good life and a bad living. That's the way the arts are. But I wanted to write about things like the need for long patience. How do you deal when inspiration fails? How do you deal with the reality of critics? How do you deal with time? How do you deal with something that starts at one time and you change completely by the time you've reached the end of it? How does collaboration work? How do you the wisdom of other arts, the magical bond with artists across time? What is your role in your social responsibility to the world? And about how art keeps you young, how you have to remain curious. And I just wanted to tell the stories to the young people and give them some hope and say, this is what I know, and I'd like to offer it to you. So this was my elder book, Turning and Facing the Audience, Facing the World. And it's one more quiet book that hasn't spoken up very loudly, but its day will come. So anyway, that's that.
Nice.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Thank you so much. So if we're going to open the floor to questions, please keep your questions brief and one question at a time rather than 10. Thank you.
Could you contrast the stories that you write, quote, fiction, versus pure history like American Genocide by David Stannard?
Addressed to whom?
Well, okay. What was the last book you mentioned? American Genocide?
Genocide, David Stannard.
Oh, yeah. The demographics and all that. I'm a professor of Native American Studies. I'm a tenure professor at Metropolitan State University of Denver, and I have a textbook coming out, and I feel that there is, room for that. And I'm aware of the Stannard book, and it's fantastic. And I have a fair amount of scholarly works out there. But I think what fiction does is it opens our hearts and it opens our minds, and it has a broader reach, too. And so as much as I love the Stannard book and books like them, I think about the good that this man has done in the world with Neither Wolf Nor Dog, and I'm hoping that I can have, in my book, Winter Counts, I'm trying to open up, the society to problems with criminal justice. I'm also talking about heroin moving on to the reservation. I'm also talking about Native identity issues. So I just think that art and fiction, they can reach an audience in a different way. But I honor the work that Stannard and scholars have done.
And I can say quickly that I decided to take on an historical task at one point and wrote a book that took me 4 years to write on Chief Joseph and the flight of the Nez Perce. And I tried to write it as a story. I wanted people to be able to read it as a story. I go back to that idea that stories matter. One of the reasons I think that we need to do the kind of thing that David's doing in Winter Count is you don't want to only reach the people that are already interested. You get the Indiana files out there and some sensitive people who care about Indian subjects, but you don't get the people who will just take a story and follow into it. And you get them inside of it, and you've taught them something, you've taken them a place they didn't know they could go to. And the Native people, they're the forgotten minority. I mean, they're not a minority in the same way. They're an occupied people. And as, and it's kind of a harsh comment, but as one person said to me, that, in America, the black people took up all the airtime for American guilt. We don't have any for us. And they don't, and the Native people are a sidebar. How do we get them away from being a sidebar? Scholarly works and works of pure history are wonderful, but you need to sort of lead people into finding out about the reality of the Native experience. So that's why I tend to go the route that I do. And so, yeah.
I got introduced to Craig Johnson by the Longmire series, and it was fabulous, and then I started reading his books. So I have two things. One is, have you thought about having your work put in a video form?
Yes, so Craig Johnson, if you're not aware, writes the Longmire series, which was on, was it AMC? I'm not sure, but he has like 15 books, is one of my favorite writers. he writes, I think, first of all, he's a great writer. His books are page turners, but he writes about Native issues, I think, in a realistic way. He is blurbing my book, Winter Count. He has it right now. And so I highly recommend Craig Johnson. He's also a wonderful man. Yes, my film agent is currently shopping my book. I have 2 of these books coming out, and if they do well, Echo HarperCollins will do more. And my film agent is currently talking with the FX network about turning it into a series. But the odds of that happening are 1 in a million. So, I know nothing about this. And I should point out, neither Wolf nor Dog was made into a film. I'm one of the lucky people. I have a DVD. I think they're not easy to get.
No.
I looked today on Amazon, it's going for $200, and I have one, and it's a great movie. I know we don't have a ton of time here, but his book was made into a very nice film, so.
And my second question is, how do we stop people from conflating all the Native Americans into sort of one thing? I went to a play and there was a character from Denver and they talked about her knowing about the Navajo. And I went like, I don't think so.
Do you mind if I take this one to start?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay.
I talked to them
that is,
already.
I don't want to shut Kent out of this. That is an issue that we deal with all the time. I am Lakota. Okay, my people are from, the Rosebud. And I don't pretend to be an expert on all Native nations. And it is a problem because my students come to me and they think that I know everything about every Native issue, and I don't. I really don't. Now, I do have a textbook coming out, Introduction to Native American Studies, but even, just the enormity of what I don't know. So, I don't know there's an easy answer. How do we get people to not conflate all natives into one sort of pan-Indian identity? Because we're not. We're 570 plus different nations. So I think that's a wonderful point. I don't know if you want to add on to that or not.
Well, if there's someone else, we'll just go ahead. The less I know about something, the more I'm willing to say. So, yeah, I probably better shut up. I think.
Hello. I'm currently reading The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, which tells all the horrible things that didn't make it into the history books. And it's sold millions of copies over decades, I think. Why are we still so ignorant?
Look at our president. No, I think we construct a narrative. And once we get the narrative, it's hard to change the narrative. And that's why I think things like the Spotted Tail book become very important. That the narrative, the kids have to be given a different narrative. I can do this to you, and I do it very often to people. If I say to you, what's this? Most of you will say a hand. If I say to you, what's this Thanksgiving? What is it? A turkey, absolutely. Because we drew our turkeys with our hands. That's what I knew as a kid growing up. If the children start to know about Spotted Tail, rather than guys with silver buckles on their shoes shaking hands with Indians and making little turkeys, then things change. But we need to get them young. We need to give them a different narrative.
And I'd like to jump in on that because the Zinn book is wonderful, but there are 2 books out there right now that if you're not aware of, and I know I've got some of my cousins from Pine Ridge in the room. Thank you for coming, my relations, But if you're not aware, there are 2 books right now. One is an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States by, what is her name, Ortiz, but it's just been adapted for children. An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States adapted by Debbie Reese. And it is for middle school and high school. I'm sure you guys know of it because we talked a little bit before then. One of you teaches at the high school. And so if you're not aware of this, or if you're interested, it just came out, adopted by Debbie Reese, and it is exactly what we're talking about. It's a history book that doesn't bury the Native experience. And so I just want to, again, let you be aware of these 2 wonderful books that are out there.
And what was the other one? You said there were 2.
They're the same book. One is for adults and one is for children. So they're both called An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States.
I just want to share that I was recently in Victoria, British Columbia, And I did, several years ago I was in Europe and I took several walking tours of Paris, historical walking tours. It's a way I like to learn about cities. In Victoria, the history started with the First Nations people. And it was so powerful to have history begin with the land and with the first people. And I really appreciate hearing about this book that you just talked about, because I feel like, you know, as white people, we think history starts when we show up. And I just wonder if you have seen any models in the United States where you see real honoring of the Native history live, you know, actually happening.
David, yeah.
I know we don't have a lot of time here, and so I just want to say that is Dr. Saul in here? In a couple hours, I'll be engaging in a panel with John Ralston Saul, the Canadian political philosopher, and we're going to talk, I think, not so much about fiction, but we're going to talk about some of these issues. Because in Canada, the Indigenous experience, I think, is somewhat different. Indigenous people there, I think, have a greater space culturally and intellectually. And I'm going to let John Ralston Saul make that point. But I think there are some models out there, but I think we need to look to our neighbors to the north. And so I believe that's at 3:15 today. Anyway, so I'll stop there.
Does anybody else have one last question, and then we need to wrap up? I think we're good. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Thank you.